Important notes about online learning. On the course page, you'll find a very useful document with some hints and tips on how to manage your data and to reduce your data consumption. Download the slides and go through them along with the video or audio, and please pay special attention to the lecture outcomes. The outcomes tell you what you need to be able to do in order to pass the assessment. This means that the outcomes define the scope of your assessment. You still need to make notes and try and express things in your own words, and this is going to be very important for your own understanding. You still need to go through the prescribed reading and do the exercises, and you still need to explore further through additional reading, online investigation. For instance, YouTube has some wonderful linguistic resources. Remember that your evidence of engagement will all be part of your portfolio. Every lecturer hopes that all students do these things anyway, but when you are doing online learning from home, the opportunities to do so are quite different. It becomes even more important that you do these things. You will need to manage your own time and take responsibility for your own learning. Hold tight and enjoy the lecture. Head movement and parametric variation. At the very beginning of this course, I issued a promissory note to you when I said that syntax was not just about learning the grammar of a particular language, such as English, but was also able to explain the diversity of the world's languages, as well as the similarities between them. But until now, we focused very largely on English, and that's been because we've been developing our theory and our basic understanding of its basic operations. We're now in a position to make good on our initial promise, to explore how the simple cycle of operations that we've outlined so far can shed light on the syntactic structures of the world's languages. During this lecture, we're going to be looking at how the head movement constraint affects verb movement to explain differences between languages such as English, French, and German. In our lecture on minimality, we explored a common syntactic phenomenon where a construction can move from position to position but is not allowed to skip over an intervening position. The head movement constraint is one particular instance of this type of relativized minimality. The head movement constraint, which was developed by Travis in 1984, says that a move can move strictly from head to head position, but it may not skip a head in between. And when a head moves, it adjoins to the new head and creates effectively a new word. Just to recap, we can see this in inversion constructions in English. If we take a basic sentence like "you would have eaten the chicken" and apply the inversion operation, the highest verb moves to the left of the subject, and in fact that moves to the head of what we call the complementizer phrase, the CP. This would yield "would you have eaten the chicken?" and that's all fine. What we can't do though is take the next highest verb, have, the auxiliary, and move it to that same position, but in so doing skipping across the modal would. This would yield "have you would eaten the chicken," which of course is word salad. And so from this we can see that the head movement constraint applies. A head can move to the next highest head, but cannot skip over an intervening head. So that's going to be the theoretical insight we're going to be applying in the following lecture. And let's turn now to a problem that we have been thinking about as we've been developing our syntactic trees, namely how to link the inflection head and the verb head. Paradoxically, the syntactic structure that we've been developing suggests that the verb starts out quite low in the structure inside the verb phrase, but that the features which are important to the verb occur much higher up in the structure. So these would include our tense features, our 5 features which are person, number, and gender, as well as case features and perhaps even EPP features. So how then do we capture this idea that these features are separate in the structure but are still quite intimately related to each other? It seems that the inflection needs to be supported by a verbal element in some way, so what are the possible options? The first option is to try do support. So we might take an auxiliary, modal, or just do and merge it into the head of the inflection node, yielding something like "my pet penguin does often eat in the lavatory." Another option, if we don't have an auxiliary, modal, or do in our enumeration, would be to move the verb upwards, alternatively to move the inflection downwards. And that is what we're going to be exploring in the following lecture. So how might we go about testing this hypothesis that the verb can move up or that the inflection can move down? One useful mechanism is to merge an adverbial on the verb phrase node. This makes the prediction that if the verb moves upward to the inflection node, then the verb should occur to the left of the adverb. However, if the inflections move downwards onto the verb, we should see that the verb and its inflections occur to the right of the adverbial. Let's see what the evidence says. In English, we get sentences like, penguins often eat fish in the lavatory, or my 10-year-old son often eats his dinner really quickly. These are 16 cancer-causing foods you probably eat every day. That is a newspaper headline. And Bernie Sanders probably eats healthier than you do. These are all newspaper headlines and sentences that I obtained out of a corpus. You will recall that a corpus is a set of sentences that we can use to find out if a possible structure exists or not. And in the rest of these sentences, what we see is that in English the adverbial occurs before the finite verb. This then seems to suggest that in English the inflectional features move downwards onto the verb. So this is all very well, but is it a universal feature of language? The answer seems to be no, it isn't, and we can look at a language like French to demonstrate this. Incidentally, the pattern we are about to see is also quite prevalent in a lot of other Romance languages, including Portuguese and Spanish and Italian. In French, if you wanted to say something like, I always eat outside, the main verb occurs to the left of the adverbial, je mange toujours à l'extérieur. In all these examples, you can see that the lexical verb occurs to the left of the adverbial. So in contrast to English, in French, the finite verb seems to occur before the adverbial. And this would then suggest that in French, it is the verb which raises up to the inflectional node. It might be a good idea to pause the video here so that you can have a look at this data and get used to it. Now we can take all of these complicated sentences and reduce them to a set of basic minimal pairs. So in 1a and b, we see that in a language like French, the lexical verb occurs to the left of the adverbial. In 2a and b, we can see that in a language like English, the verb remains in situ on the right-hand side of the adverbial. And in 3a and b, we can see that in English, modals and incidentally auxiliaries can occur either to the left or the right of the adverbial, so it doesn't seem to make much of a difference in that particular context. This suggests the following kind of derivation in English, where you merge your verb, then you merge your subjects and object noun phrases, you project upwards, we merge our adverbial to the verb phrase, and then project an inflectional phrase above that. The subject moves to the specifier of the inflectional phrase, and agreement occurs through the process of C-command and checks the various features. When it comes to where the inflections actually appear, it would then seem that the inflections in English move downwards from the inflection head onto the verb, which remains in its in situ position. French is similar but slightly different. Just like English, you start off with your verb, you merge your noun phrase, subjects and objects, and apply theta roles. You project your verb phrase and merge your adverbial to the verb phrase, and then you merge an inflection node which projects its inflection phrase. The noun phrase subject moves to the specifier of the inflection phrase to check EPP and other features. And once agree has applied, the inflections on the inflection head need to be supported by the verb, and the verb then moves upwards from its head and adjoins to the head of the inflection phrase. In this way, we can see that there are both similarities and differences between English and French. The similarities are quite a few. They both project an X-bar structure verb phrase. They both adjoin adverbials in exactly the same way, and they both apply theta roles in the same way. They both merge and project an inflectional phrase, and both have the subject moving to the specifier of the inflectional phrase. Also, where they are very similar is where agreement applies and checks all the various features. The difference then between French and English lies only in the fact that in French the verb moves upwards and that in English inflections move downwards. So we are starting to be able to see both the similarities between languages and also being able to account for the differences. Let's take a closer look at French. And what we have here is a very typical verbal inflection paradigm for present, past, and future. And this is the verb to love, where the root is am. So, for instance, if we look at first person plural, nous aimons, the ONS is common across the paradigm, suggesting that ONS, on, reflects person and number, namely first person plural. If we look a little bit closer at the past and future paradigm, you'll notice that there is another morpheme, which I've indicated in green, which seems to occur between the root and the person number morpheme. And we can infer that from this that this morpheme reflects tense. So unlike English, where tense, person, and number are mixed up and bundled up together in portmanteau morphemes, in French they seem to be fairly distinct. Now, where does this leave our current analysis of French, which we have in this particular tree? This tree accurately reflects the fact that the verb occurs in the head of the inflection phrase, and therefore comes before the adverbial. However, the verbal head is clearly a complex morpheme with at least 3 separate morphs in it. And it seems a bit unsatisfying just to leave it like that, because we currently have no way of explaining why it occurs in that particular configuration. On the other hand, if we take that complex verbal form and break it into its component part, we notice that already 2 of those have been derived in the tree itself. So the lexical verb root is merged as the head of the verb phrase, and the various inflections are merged in the head of the inflection phrase. So let's take a closer look at that inflection phrase and perhaps consider expanding it into 2 separate layers. Now we're going to call one tense phrase because it is headed by a tense marker, and for the sake of convenience I'm going to call the other one agreement phrase because it is headed by the 5 features which trigger person and number agreement. So what we've done here is taken that simple inflection phrase and broken it up into 2 separate parts to create this particular tree. So the subject is merged in the specifier of the verb phrase and moves to the specifier of the tense phrase, and then on upwards to the specifier of the agreement phrase. The verb starts out merged as the head of the verb phrase and then moves to the head of the tense phrase, and then together with the tense marker moves to the head of the agreement phrase and creates a complex verbal construction along the way. You will also notice that the verb moves from head to head position and thus obeys the head movement constraint. In fact, let's take this idea a little bit further. What if the fact that French has a rich regular morphology is not a historical accident, but is actually determined by the syntactic structure? And similarly, the fact that English has portmanteau morphemes, which combine person, number, and gender and tense into single morphemes, is not a historical accident, but is determined by the syntactic structure. So in French, the tense and person, number morphemes must adjoin to a root. As the lexical verb moves from head to head, it presents itself to the morphemes which are able then to adjoin to it without any trouble at all. Now let's look at English. If the inflection is lowering from the inflection node down to the verbal node, then it wouldn't be possible to have a split inflectional layer consisting of both agreement and tense. Imagine if in English the agreement morphology moved down to the tense morphology and had to adjoin to it, but both of these require a verbal root to adjoin to, and at this point in the derivation the verbal root is still at the bottom of the sentence inside the verb phrase. Clearly a downward movement of inflection from the agreement node to a tense node would not be licit. This effectively means that in tense lowering languages like English, it is not possible to have a split inflectional node because it would create a point in the derivation where the morphology would not be able to adjoin to a lexical verb. If this approach is on the right track, then it is absolutely no accident that a verb raising language like French can have a split inflectional layer, whereas an inflection lowering language like English cannot. Now you might be wondering, is this what occurs in every language, or is it really just French? The answer, I think, is that it depends a little bit on the morphology. In French, the morphological marking clearly gives us an indication that these 2 separate projections might exist. Thus, the complex morphology of French gives an indication that there is a complex inflectional layer. In contrast, in English, the morphology do not give an indication that such a split may exist, and so the relatively simple morphology of English yields a relatively simple inflectional layer. From the perspective of the child learning the language as they are gradually exposed to it, you can imagine that as they're exposed to French and realize that the French verb includes complex morphology, that a child might use that as a cue to grow a layered inflectional layer in its grammar, whereas an English child would not be exposed to the same kind of evidence, and so the inflectional layer might remain relatively simple in that language. Let's look at verb and adverbial orders in a language somewhat closer to home, namely Afrikaans. And you will notice that in Afrikaans, in main clauses, the lexical verb occurs to the left-hand side of the adverbial. I've marked the lexical verbs in red and the adverbials are underlined. So it would initially seem that Afrikaans looks quite similar to French, and we can therefore postulate that Afrikaans has its main verb moving to the inflectional node. I would advise that you pause the video at this point so that you can look at this data in a bit more detail at your own pace and make sure that you understand what's going on. So while the previous slide seemed to suggest that Afrikaans verbs raised to the inflection node, this cannot be the whole story because of the following type of data, where we have a prepositional phrase, on Sundays, op Sondag, which occurs at the front of the sentence. It is immediately followed by the lexical verb, which precedes the subject and also the adverbial. Now, if we know that the subject is in the specifier of the inflection phrase, then if the verb occurs to the left of the subject, it must be the head of a higher projection yet. And then the prepositional phrase, op Sondag, would probably be in the specifier of that higher position. You may already have encountered this higher position in some of your reading, and it's called the complementizer phrase, or CP. Incidentally, this kind of pattern is called V2 or verb second, where we see that the verb is always the second constituent in the sentence, and that the first constituent could be a prepositional phrase, could be a subject, it could be a topicalized object, or in fact, any other constituent, just so long as the verb is in the second position. This pattern is shared by languages such as Afrikaans, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, German, Dutch, and many more. Here you can see how this might work in practice. The subject moves from the specifier of the verb phrase up to the specifier of the inflection phrase. Then the verb moves from its in situ position in the head of the verb phrase up to the head of the inflection phrase, and then onwards to the head of the complementizer phrase. Of course, it is also possible that the inflection phrase is divided into two layers itself, including a tense phrase and an agreement phrase, as in French, and this might depend on the particular language we're talking about. To summarize then, in English, the verb remains in situ and doesn't move to the inflectional head, although modals and auxiliaries probably do. In French, the verb moves from the verb position to the inflection position. And in a language like Afrikaans, the verb moves from the verb position to the inflectional position, and then in addition moves onward to the C position. So we are now able to start answering a major question in modern linguistics. That is, how can we explain the deep similarities between languages while simultaneously accounting for the differences? Part of the answer to these interrelated questions comes from something called the principles and parameters model of language variation. According to this approach, language consists of universal invariant principles as well as language-specific settings of parameters. Principles might include basic X-bar theory, theta role assignment, the head movement constraint, minimality, merge, move, and agree, etc. On the other hand, there may be language-specific settings which we call parameters. For instance, a language might have V to T movement or T to C movement. Another kind of parametric setting between languages might be the order of head and complements. In one language, such as English, a head might precede the complement, and in another language like Japanese, the complement might precede the head. The combination of these universal principles and language-specific settings of these parameters would result in a particular language. If we plot out some of these parameters in a table, we can start to see where languages are similar and where languages are different. For instance, in the table on the screen, I have plotted English, French, isiXhosa, Japanese, Afrikaans, and German with respect to verb movement. English and isiXhosa do not have verb movement to the inflectional node. However, French, Japanese, Afrikaans, and German all have verb movement to the inflectional node. However, when it comes to movement to the complementizer node, English, French, Xhosa, and Japanese do not have verb movement to this higher position, whereas Afrikaans, German, and Icelandic do. On the screen there are a number of other settings which may be of interest to you but which we haven't covered in this particular lecture, but hopefully we'll be able to cover in the lectures to come. To conclude, the head movement constraint allows heads to move from head to head without skipping any intermediate heads. Verbs and inflection are linked through a process of movement mediated by the head movement constraint. Our theory of syntax is starting to explain the similarities between and the diversity of human languages. We account for the similarities between languages using universal principles, while we account for the differences between languages using language-specific settings of parameters.